I've been teaching myself calligraphy since 2020. I never went to a class. I don't even think I used a tracing sheet, but I just spent years of practice and just experimenting with my style. And I'm saying this not to flex, but because I have a lot of experience learning how to do calligraphy and I want to teach you guys how to do it too. So welcome to my beginner's complete guide for how to do calligraphy. I'm going to teach you guys in 5 different chapters, all of the information I think you need to know. I do have a free downloadable PDF for you guys to practice your calligraphy with. There'll be timestamps down below for you to reference, and let's just get into it. So the first thing we need to talk about is supplies. So number 1, you're going to need a pencil and an eraser because you got to start with the basics. You got to be able to practice before you jump in with a pen. Next, let's talk about paper. So there is a difference between like rough and smooth paper. Copy paper is very smooth, for example, and then like watercolor paper is more textured and grainy. You want to use really smooth paper when you do calligraphy. That way the grain in the paper doesn't destroy or damage the nib of your pen, because if the little nib of your pen gets frayed, then your calligraphy pen itself becomes much harder to use and it's not as precise. Speaking of pen-wise, calligraphy pens I recommend are Tombow Fudenosuke pens. They're the ones I use all the time. Ironically, this microphone is attached to a Tombow Fudenosuke calligraphy pen. This one is the hard tip. It's in blue. The soft tip is in green. Personally, if you're a beginner, I'd recommend the hard tip because it's easier to control, but they usually come in a pack of 2. And also, I got a question about like pricing for things, so I'm going to get you guys cheaper options too, because Tombows are about $2 for $6 on Amazon, so $2.94 per pen. But another option is the Pentel Fudotouch calligraphy pen. I don't have one on me, but those are also really good. They're kind of in between the hard and soft pen for Tombow, I feel, and you can get it for $3 for $6 on Amazon or $1.97 per. So brush pens are very similar to calligraphy pens. I would call these calligraphy pens because the nib is smaller and they're black. Marker brush pens in my mind are usually, they can come in different colors. The nib is usually longer, more flexible, stuff like that. So the most common ones that I use are Tombow dual brush pens. These can be pretty expensive, but they're really good quality because the nib is like very controlled and it like takes a long time for it to loosen and fray. These can go for $10 for $26 on Amazon, so about $2.60 per marker. Another option are the Ohuhu color art markers. Those on their website are really cheap. You can get a pack of 60 for like $23, so that's 36 cents per pen. There are also Artist Loft pens, which you can get for $1.20 per on Amazon. Arteza pens, these are definitely a looser nib, so a little harder to control if you're a beginner, but you can get them for $1.33 on Amazon. The last thing I'd recommend here are Crayola markers, like Crayola Super Tips. These are not brush pens at all. They're just normal marker nibs. However, I find that you can actually do calligraphy with them because they are pretty flexible and they are super cheap. You can get a pack of like 50 pens for like, I don't know, $10, $50 on Amazon. Like, they're really cheap. The last thing in the supplies I'll mention here is a quill pen, or like one of those dip in ink calligraphy pens that people do. I have one. I actually have a couple back at my house. I only have one here at the dorm, but I don't use it very often. I'm gonna try it for this video. I'll put some B-roll right here. Let's see if I can actually use it. Yeah, but if you want to be fancy and old-fashioned, use a quill pen, more power to you. Just for clarification before I go any farther, whenever I say calligraphy, I am not talking about like really old-fashioned medieval calligraphy and like fancy hand lettering styles. That is so impressive if you can do that. I 100% commend you. Personally though, we're going to be mostly talking about this style of calligraphy that I feel is much more popular, especially in the bullet journaling world. Alright, so let's move on to chapter 2, which is finding your style. I think this is super important because, like I just said, there are so many different types and styles of calligraphy that you can choose from. Some I'm much more experienced in than others, like I mentioned, but whenever you're learning to do calligraphy, you obviously don't have to do what I do. You can do whatever you want. What I recommend is finding inspiration pictures to start with and like base your knowledge off of. When I was first learning calligraphy, I was 100% on Pinterest like all the time, scrolling and finding inspiration pictures. You can also look on Instagram, TikTok, Google Images, you know, wherever you want to find images of inspiration. You can also find pictures from different creators like me or someone else. Whenever I was doing it, especially when I was teaching myself more advanced calligraphy styles like ombre and things like that, one person I really looked for inspiration is Alison Bujos. I think she still has an Instagram with that handle. Her calligraphy was super inspiring to me, especially like a couple years ago. I like really studied what she did so I could replicate it with myself. So I 100% recommend finding inspiration because that's like a good place to start your knowledge base. And while you're looking for inspiration, another thing you can do is like compare different styles. So in like the hand lettering calligraphy realm, there are multiple different types of calligraphy, like subcategories. So there could be like really elegant fonts, for example. I would describe these as italicized, like dramatic and elongated shapes, you know. Another option is like really minimal styles, like super small letters as far as like the height of the letter. It could be like spaced out letters, stuff like that. Or you could do something more similar to my style of calligraphy, which is very bouncy and like playful. So I would say that there's a lot of contrast in the height. It's possibly like thicker and wider calligraphy, like you press down really hard on the pen to make those thicker lines. And like it has like a little bit more playful like swoops and curls and stuff like that. So, you know, like when you're finding inspiration pictures that like you think you want to recreate, take note of what am I seeing here that I like? What is a reoccurring theme in all these images that are specifically calling to me? Once you narrow that down, you will know how to implement those specific things into the style whenever you write it yourself. Okay, we'll come back to the inspiration pictures in just a second, but let's move on to chapter 3, which is getting accustomed to the calligraphy pen and style. So this might sound a little redundant, but we need to talk about how to get a good hold on the pen itself, because when you're writing with a pencil or like any other normal pen, most people usually write pretty up and down, like they'll hold the pen and they'll write straight up and down. But the thing about calligraphy is you're using a pen with a flexible nib, and so if you write straight up and down, not only will you damage the nib, you're not going to get the calligraphy element, because the calligraphy part is using the flexible nib to go back and forth between thinner and thicker lines. So because of that, whenever you hold the pen, you have to hold it at a slight angle to the paper. And again, it takes a little practice, and you'll kind of feel it out the more you do it to kind of see like what angle is best for, you know, your hand and also the style of calligraphy that you're using. But I tend to rest my side of my like hand on the page, hold my fingers like this so that the side of the nib is almost parallel to the paper or to the table, and then I can, you know, adjust the pen as I'm actually writing and using it. Another thing is control. So for example, if you're doing very minimal like calligraphy with like small, short, spaced out letters, you may want more control over your pen. So in which case I'd recommend holding it further down the barrel, like closer to the nib. However, if you're trying to do more elongated, more dramatic styles and you don't want to have a lot of control, you want it to be like flowy and wispy, I'd recommend holding it a little further down the pen, like closer to the end, not close to the tip. That way you can kind of let your wrist, you know, be loose and let the pen do its thing. Okay, so the next thing I recommend is practicing up and down strokes. So one specific part of calligraphy that makes it calligraphy is the fact that there's differentiation between the thickness of the lines as you're drawing. If you look at this inspiration picture right here, you can note that there are certain parts of the lines that are much thinner and certain parts that are thicker. And this comes from the pressure that you're using whenever you actually press down on the pen. So usually, it doesn't have to be this way, but usually whenever you draw calligraphy, all of your upstrokes are usually going to be very light. So you only touch the very, very tip of the pen to the paper, and you use not a lot of pressure at all to draw. However, for the downstrokes, that's usually where the thickness or the weight of the actual letter gets thicker. And so that's when you're going to need to press down more with the calligraphy pen to make that thick line. Now, don't press down so much that you're like, you know, jamming the pen into the paper and like damaging the nib. Like I said, the nib is flexible, so it will kind of bend and, you know, move with you. But usually it's like you only use the teensy little tip of the nib whenever you're doing the thin lines, and then you use more of the side of the nib and press down a little more whenever you're using the downstroke and thicker lines, and that's going to help you with your up and down strokes. So to practice that, I would practice doing little lines up, little lines down, and then little N's and U's to kind of practice that up and down squiggle and get your hand used to transitioning from light to harder with the pressure, light to harder. And like once you get that flowy motion, that's when you'll be prepared to actually do letters, because of course letters have different shapes and, you know, whatever. So you need to get used to actually feeling the difference between thinner and thicker lines first. Another thing you can do is use a tracing sheet. So this is something that I've actually prepared for you guys. So I made this tracing sheet. It's not just one, it's like 4 in here. But it has all the letters of the alphabet that I drew out in my calligraphy. Now, my printer printed them very light. I adjusted the PDF, so it's not actually going to be this light for you guys, but they have all of the letters on the side here, so you can trace over the gray letters, and then you can also practice down the line, like drawing it and repeating it, just like you did in kindergarten when you're learning the ABCs. So I feel like this is very helpful. I didn't use it when I first started, however, I think I can definitely recognize the benefits, because looking at someone else's, even if it's not necessarily the style that you're looking for, but just practicing going over the letters and copying that letter over and over is helpful in training your brain to learn, hey, this is the technique that I need to be using for calligraphy. Because calligraphy is kind of a technique. It's a style of writing that you have to train yourself for, just like you have to learn how to write or learn how to do cursive. It's very similar to that. So this PDF is available for free to download on my website. I'll have the link below for you. There are like 4 pages here, and then the last page has a couple blank rows at the bottom for you to use because it doesn't go all the way to the end. So plenty of space to practice your calligraphy, and I definitely recommend trying this. Okay, so you may be wondering, what am I going to use those inspiration pics that I just found and want to replicate? Well, here's where you can use them. So I would grab your pencil and your eraser, because first we need to kind of sketch out the letters themselves. And this is a little boring, I get it. But I say this because if you're going to be replicating pictures like from the internet, you have to like kind of look and analyze them. You know, you can't just immediately like whip out, you know, calligraphy and start drawing if you're not actually practiced and used to doing calligraphy. So take your pencil, try to copy the shapes, maybe trace it from, you know, on your phone or something on a piece of paper, maybe just look at an image and copy it down. Practice, you know, seeing the shapes and what's consistent between all of them. Are they all italic? Are they all this height? Do they all have this swoop at the beginning or the end? You know, what is specific about this? And like practice drawing it first. The other thing is, whenever you draw, of course, you may just draw a single line because your pencil doesn't have the flexible nib that your calligraphy pen has. So this is where I recommend faux calligraphy. And faux calligraphy can actually be a design choice in itself rather than doing actual calligraphy, or it can be a way to test yourself and to practice doing real calligraphy and recognizing where the up and down strokes are. So basically in faux calligraphy, you just draw like whatever word it is, and you did it in monoline, which is just like one line, like with a pencil, no different weights first. But then you look at your image, or you just look at all the downstrokes and like where your pen goes down, and you add a second line around those curves. And this is demonstrating and like teaching your brain, these are the sections where I need to press down harder because this is where it's going to be thicker. So by teaching yourself faux calligraphy and like analyzing, hey, what parts of the word are thicker, and this could definitely change too depending on what style you're trying to recreate. But by learning this, you're recognizing when you're going to need to press down harder with the calligraphy pen once you actually pull that out and use it. Okay, speaking of, so now let's move on to chapter 4, which is hand lettering on your own. Now we can finally pull out that black calligraphy pen or maybe your brush pen and practice just going at it and doing calligraphy. Now, we've done a lot of, you know, warm-ups, so it may be a little stressful, but at this point, you know, you have a little bit of knowledge, you kind of know what you're doing. Let's just put pen to paper and just, you know, try it. Crash and burn, see what happens. It's going to be bad. I'm letting you know right now, it's going to be bad. It's going to be pretty ugly, and you're going to hate it because that's what I did, that's what everyone does. But that's kind of the point. It's not an easy thing to learn. It just takes practice and training your brain and training your hand to make the motions to create what you have envisioned in your head that you want to draw and write out. This step, I have really not much else to explain because it really just means you got to go for it. You got to practice. You got to write. You just got to keep doing it. You got to keep doing your calligraphy. And like I said, I taught myself calligraphy over the span of like, this is my 5th year, I think, doing it. And I still like make changes every now and then at a much slower pace than I used to when I was first learning. But it just takes time and effort. And over, you know, span of weeks, months, you'll definitely see an improvement. It's just like changing your handwriting. Like it's gonna start slow. You gotta write slow. Ooh, that's a big one. Make sure you're starting slow. You're not like whipping out the pen. You gotta write slowly. But over time, you will definitely see an improvement. And you'll have beautiful lettering. Like imagine you're like writing a birthday card to someone and you can like really, you know, elegantly write their name on the front. Like that is such a flex. Trust me, I know. Like, but it just takes a little practice to get to that point. Okay, chapter 5. So now you talk about adding variety to your lettering, and this is the part where we're going to be experimenting and finding our own style. We're no longer depending on tracing sheets and inspiration pictures. That was a thing of the past. Instead, we need to learn how to make our own style and adjust these things. And I have 4 different categories of like ways to change your style. I'll try to go through them very quickly. So number 1 is height. Whenever you look at, like, for example, on my tracing sheet, you can see that there are 3 lines that you write on. There's the ascending, the descending, and then the X line in the middle. But some letters go to the top of the ascending, some letters go to the bottom of the descending or past it or higher. Some letters only go to the X height, and it all depends. And this is, you know, pretty common knowledge. I'm sure if you write, you can recognize this. However, there are ways to tweak it. So maybe you want your letters to be super tall and extend way past the barriers. Maybe you want them to be really small and everything stays super small and in the barriers, and maybe even only to the X height. Something to practice with and see like what your style wants to be. Another thing is thickness and width. So this mostly comes with how you're pressing down. Obviously, if you press down more, it's going to be a thicker downstroke. However, this can also depend on the flexibility of the nib itself. So like I said, a Tombow hard tip is going to be less flexible than a Tombow soft tip. So that means if you use the same amount of pressure on both pens, the soft tip will make a thicker line than the hard tip just because it is more flexible. Also, brush pens, in my experience, since they are a taller nib than a normal calligraphy pen, they're going to make thicker lines because there's more ink to put on the paper. So this kind of changes, the thickness of your letters themselves. In this section, I also want to talk about monoline real quick. Monoline calligraphy is, like I mentioned before, whenever you're doing calligraphy with just a pencil, you can't change the thickness with just the pencil itself. So monoline calligraphy is like doing calligraphy but not changing the thickness at all. Maybe you're using like a normal pen. It's kind of similar, I guess, to cursive. This is a design choice in itself. So I do this sometimes in my journal when I don't feel like doing calligraphy. You use the same style of lettering, but you just don't have any difference in your thickness, and that can be an option as well. The next subcategory is angle. So do you want your calligraphy to be very italicized, very not italicized and straight up and down? Things to think about. Like I mentioned earlier, the elegant style and like dramatic style of calligraphy may be more italicized than very like traditional straight up and down like cursive kind of styles, something to play around with. Another thing I want to mention here is left hand calligraphy, because I'm right-handed, so like whenever I write, I have no problems not smearing the ink because I obviously write in the opposite direction. However, I know that lefties may have a little bit more trouble with this, so the angle of the pen is important, but we'll talk about that at the end of the video. So that's a little bonus chapter I'll talk about for my lefty girlies out there. And then the last one is spacing. So this is the space in between the letters themselves. In typography, this is called tracking, and this can differ a lot. So do you want your letters to be very far away, like have a very long gap in between the H and the E in hello? Maybe you want them super close together and like really minimal. That could be an option as well. Play around with it, mess around, find your style. That is the overall message of this video, is you have to practice and find your own style, because it's not going to look exactly like someone else's. It may take inspiration from someone else's, but your handwriting is completely unique to you and not like anyone else's. So therefore your calligraphy will be the exact same way. Now, I know that you guys are probably wondering, because there are a lot of inspiration pictures out there, about how to do fancy styles with your calligraphy, like ombre, drop shadows, 3D, sparkle effects, highlights, stuff like that. And I love those types of calligraphy, like styles and everything. However, I'm not going to talk about that in this video because this video would take way too long. So I've made a couple shorts. By shorts, I mean it's on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, showing like, how to do shadow calligraphy, how to do ombre calligraphy. So definitely you can go find those. I'll try to link maybe one or two down below, but comment below in this video what style you want to learn, like if it's a specific drop shadow style, if it's a specific like 3D style of calligraphy. These are more of the artistic ways that you can like push your calligraphy to be more fancy and artistic. Let me know and I will try to make tutorials for them, because I can, play around with it, try it. But I'm not gonna talk about that in this video though, because like I said, it would take 40 years. All right, so we've made it to the bonus chapter, which is for my left-hand girlies. Now, I'm not left-handed, but I was thinking about it and I was like, you know what, that's right. If you're left-handed, because you write this way, it's probably a little difficult to not smear the ink. So I found an article online that I will link down below for you with a couple different ideas. One of them is to hold further down the barrel, so you're further away from the ink itself. I'm sure this is something that lefties do most of the time anyway. My dad is a left-handed guy and I see him, hold the pen a little further down. Remember that this will affect your control that you have over the letters themselves. Another thing is they have these like oblique pens and oblique calligraphy pens. Super fancy, super cool. It like adjusts the nib so that when you're writing here, it's actually like inking a little bit higher into the left, I think. So those may be something you may be looking into or interested in. I'm not left-handed, so I can't say too much about this, but I did do my little research. So I will link the article down below where I found all this information and other ideas for you, so you can look down there. But I will say, there are multiple pens that are like really fast drawing. Like the marker brush pens might smear a little bit more, but like Tombow Fudenosuke pens I find are super fast drawing and like will immediately sink into the paper itself. So like if you use that, there shouldn't be any smearing whenever you're writing, because it really does dry very, very fast. So that's my tip for you. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking. I hope by this point in the video, you're feeling a little more confident. You have the tools that you need to just step out there and try it. Like I said, it's not gonna be perfect. There's going to be an ugly stage like there is with everybody, but it takes some practice, it takes some time, and I believe in you. You can do it. If this is something that you want to learn how to do, you just gotta have the dedication to practice and practice until it gets better. Like I said, I have my calligraphy tracing practice sheet. It'll be linked down in the description box below. Completely free to download. Absolutely made it just for you guys, so download it down below. Also, comment down below any questions that you have. I'm always answering all of my comments, so I will see all of your questions and I will answer as best as I can. Subscribe because I post bullet journaling videos and productivity videos like this every single week. And I also post YouTube shorts all the time, so you don't want to miss out on any of my content. And with that, I love you guys so much. Good luck with your calligraphy, and I will see you guys next week. Goodbye.